Folks, our next and final speaker this evening is Elizabeth Neumann. She is the Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot, which is a social enterprise working to end online harms such as violent extremism, disinformation, child sexual exploitation, gender-based violence, and human trafficking by applying evidence, ethics, and human rights. Ms. Neumann recently served as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security in the United States, where she led 8 programs and policy teams addressing a range of issues, including domestic violent extremism, the screening and vetting, countering terrorism, and transnational criminal organizations, as well as human trafficking. Since departing from government in 2020, Ms. Neumann has been passionately educating the public about this growing threat of disinformation and domestic violent extremism. She's done this through appearances on CNN, MSNBC, PBS, NPR 2020, and 60 Minutes, among others. And she's a board member of the National Immigration Forum, as well as a founder and member of the Council on National Security and Immigration, and a national security contributor at ABC News. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Yusuf. That was a very generous introduction. I thank you all for coordinating and facilitating the conversation. It's so important that we start talking more about this. I'm going to do something a little different than my other co-presenters. I'm going to share some slides. Yusuf and Tariq suggested that some of the interesting work that Moonshot does is better presented graphically, so I hope you'll enjoy some of that. Let me start first by sharing a bit about Moonshot. We work with governments, we work with tech companies, community organizations to end violent extremism and other online harms. It is a company that really had its origins in trying to push back actually against white supremacism and Salafi jihadism, and has expanded in recent years to address a variety of other challenges. Meeting today and on the anniversary of Christchurch holds a rather special memory for me. 3 years ago, I was at the Department of Homeland Security, and in that capacity had flown to Malaga, Spain. I was sitting at a U-shaped table with Interior Ministry representatives from about 100 countries at the annual Global Counterterrorism Forum meeting. And we were there, we actually met on the 14th, and we were there to discuss what are we going to do about those people from our countries that had gone to Syria to fight as foreign fighters. And now we needed to figure out how to bring them home, how to prosecute them, rehabilitate, or what, but not let them just sit in SDF prisons. So that was the topic of conversation. To facilitate an introduction, the organizers, the chairs asked us to go around and very quickly, all 100 of us, introduce our top 3 threats that we were facing. And in the context of an organization that came together to fight ISIS, what was remarkable was by the time we were halfway around the table, it became very clear that there was a trend. And that trend may have gone by different names, but it was right-wing violent extremism to some, it was white supremacism to some, it was racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. So different labels, but all describing the rise of a new terrorist threat. And this wasn't a surprise in that we knew we had a problem in the United States. The surprise was the global nature of it. By the time we were done, I would estimate 80% of the people representing 100 countries globally were articulating at least one of their top 3 threats coming from this movement of really, with it at its core, as Heidi said, a lot of it comes down to a great replacement theory, anti-Semitism, white supremacism. The next morning, I had to get up really early to catch a flight. I got in the cab and looked at my phone, and the alerts started coming in that And by the time we were getting the news alerts, it was very clear that it was a very devastating attack. I've been in counterterrorism for 20 years, and every time you get the news that something devastating has happened, it always feels like a failure. It always feels like we should have done more. But this one had a particular, it just really hit that something that we had not caught early enough in the United States, and arguably we're exporting to other parts of the world, was now impacting, one of the most remote parts of the world, New Zealand. And the gravity of how late we were to the game really hit me. So with that kind of personal connection to the moment, I certainly spent a lot of my time at DHS trying to figure out how we could better go after the threat, better understand the threat, and hopefully prevent the threat. When I left government, I had the opportunity last year to join Moonshot. And part of the reason I'm so excited to be with them is that they are looking at how to earlier intervene with the problem. I want to give a little content warning. Some of this material is language used by white supremacists, so just a little warning in some of these displays. This is a search entered into Google by an individual in the United States the day after the Christchurch attack. This same search was replicated across the globe in New Zealand, in Norway, the United Kingdom, across dozens of countries, numerous languages, across search engines. Moments like this are not liable for takedown. You can't remove a Google search. You can't block it. And more often than not, when you search for violent extremist content on Google, it presents in the top search results. So content moderation and removal, it's important. And I applaud the work of the GIF-CT and some of the tech companies and what they have done in that space, but it's not the solution to violence and extremism online alone. Moonshot was set up with the intention to develop and use technology which would both help us understand the spread of violent extremism, but also to use the internet to actually reach people and intervene. So how do we do that? How do we find audiences at risk of violent extremism? In the month following the attack, Moonshot tracked white nationalist activity on search engines in New Zealand. This approach to gathering data has allowed us to track appetite for violent content, including searches indicating an intent to commit acts of violence or a desire to support or join violent white supremacist groups. Search traffic is non-performative, right? So as opposed to social media, search traffic offers a very unique opportunity to understand individuals who may be looking to consume white nationalist content. Every search is also an opportunity to reach those at risk of violent extremism and change their paths. Individuals at risk of violent extremism often leave behind a trail of clues in the online space. These are often publicly available clues. It's a digital footprint letting us know the path they're taking. So what we've done at Moonshot is developed databases of hundreds of thousands of online indicators of risk. This is important because we are never looking at an audience based on socio-demographic information. It is always about the behaviors online. It is people who are posting, engaging, sharing, or actively seeking hate and extremist or terrorist content. So we're looking for keywords and phrases used by these movements. We're looking for racial slurs, propaganda that they share, the music that they listen to, the content that's glorifying their heroes. We built tools that can wade through the publicly available data to find those who are leaving us a digital footprint telling us that they are at risk of being involved. Once we do that, we have developed ways that we can intervene. So our intervention campaigns specifically aim to reach people at risk of consuming violent extremist content. or endorse such, and instead offer them safer alternatives at off-ramping into disengagement and reintegration programs. So here's some examples, some basic user journeys that you see on the screen. If people were searching for violent content or to join a violent group or engaging this content on Twitter, they would be presented with an ad. Looking at the first example, you'll see it's 3%ers, which is a far-right militia group. So someone searching for this would see our ad, and if they chose to click the ad, we would redirect them to alternative content designed to speak to the underlying drivers that push people into the world of extremism. We also redirect audiences to mental health services, alternative resources. Last year, one campaign we ran in the United States helped initiate over 150 individual one-on-one counseling sessions with our partners at the Crisis Text Line. During these highly responsive campaigns, we are constantly testing different messaging strategies to optimize the alternative content and improve engagement with the target audience. Our approach is underpinned by a general finding, and you've heard a few speakers actually reference this, particularly Tony. What we have found is that extremist audiences are most receptive to non-ideological psychosocial interventions that rather than explicit counter narratives or content that's trying to undermine the ideology. You intuitively know this when you get into a holiday dinner conversation with your crazy uncle and you think he's wrong on something. You eventually give up trying to argue him out of his ideology, because the ideology is usually very set and very difficult to move somebody off of. But when we're talking about the concept of extremism, the ideology is actually the layer on top. There were other psychosocial factors that drove somebody into that extremist ideology in the first place. And what we find, and this is borne out by research done in the academic community, but also by the results that Moonshot has done globally, what we find is that people are much more likely to engage with that self-help and social service content as opposed to countering their ideology. So for example, 3 years ago, we found white supremacists were 48% more likely to engage with self-help and social service content than the general public. And when we were looking at people that were searching to join a violent group like the KKK, they were 115% more likely to click on that content, the social service and self-help content. The trend holds in every geography we try it. Across ideological spectrums, even non-Western settings, these results hold. Last year, we ran some tests in Indonesia. We had audiences engaging with Salafi jihadist content online, and they were 128% more likely to engage with psychosocial content than with ideological counter content. Here's a really interesting factor, and I think in the context of COVID makes a lot of sense. This is very particular when the intervention, that ad references loneliness. Think about that. When the ad referenced loneliness, there were 41% more likely to engage with services. So one of the things that we take away from this is that how we are intervening matters, and we can do it both in the online space, but we can also help offline intervention professionals by quickly at scale being able to figure out given what the current culture, what the current narrative is, what messages are working, what messages are less likely or less effective in that given moment. Let me move the slide to this next one. I'm going to switch topics just a bit and focus in on some work we've done in Canada. We saw a really big increase, a 19% increase in attempts to access far-right hate content in Canada's 6 largest cities during the initial early days of the pandemic. Now, here's the good news. Canada was actually significantly less of an increase than the United States. But let's think about that. Why does that happen? We know extremist movements thrive on crises. For white supremacists in particular, they have an ideology that is premised on this notion that a race war is coming. So crises are these moments where we typically see actors exploiting high levels of fear, anxiety, uncertainty, and they're trying to turn that into an opportunity for recruitment. The COVID-19 pandemic gave that opportunity, along with other concurrent crises. And now that we've been in this for 2 years, that prolonged period of crisis, we are seeing extremist actors essentially preying on vulnerable individuals in our communities. Another thing that we've been working on with Public Safety Canada is understanding the involuntary celibate phenomenon. So often called incels, they're a community whose online activity increased pretty significantly during the pandemic. We were able to work with Public Safety Canada and publish some of the first guides, the first systematic multi-platform study of the incel ecosystem. All of those guides are available on our website. But this work involved consultations with global experts, frontline service workers across Canada, and produced recommendations for interrupting the incel radicalization process and responding to violence in Canada and internationally. We've already seen that this important work that actually Canada led in is being reused and copied by Europe and the United States. So one of the things that was interesting in the study is that unfortunately Canada is a center of discussion in the incel community. Incels are fixated on Canada's progressive and feminist agenda, and they argue that any advancement of women's rights diminishes the rights of Canadian men, especially incels. They frequently glorify and occasionally incite acts of misogynistic violence in Canada and idolize perpetrators as saints who have sacrificed themselves for their community. So, of course, after the horrific vehicular attack in London, Ontario last June, we immediately saw posts inciting violence against Muslim Canadians and sharing propaganda from the Christchurch attack. So the other interesting feature about incels, and I think you heard Heidi mention this earlier, but there is this crossover, and we actually posted a blog on our website just last week that talks about this subset of white supremacist incels that promote anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, including the Great Replacement theory. And they're using this white supremacist incel ideology to indoctrinate new members. It's particularly concerning that we have such narratives in forums frequented by vulnerable men, and it definitely poses a challenge to responding to the online violent misogynist threat. So incels is still something that I think we're all struggling to better understand. It is growing exponentially, as you can see from the graph there on the slide. But I would invite anybody to view our website where you can learn more about the incel phenomenon and some strategies to address that challenge. I want to close, sort of no pressure, right? Because you're the last speaker and everybody's ready to move on with their evening. But I want to reflect a little bit on the fact that I've been a counterterrorism practitioner for 20 years, and it took us a really long time. Really, it was too long for us to see that we had this growing metastasizing white supremacist problem, violent white supremacist problem in our country, in the United States. I won't, of course, speak for Canada, but it also has taken us way too long for us to invest in prevention. And one of the things that I have hope in is that we've turned that corner and we are building out local prevention capability. And when you have that offline capability, we would encourage everybody to consider that an online complement is necessary, a way to reach people where they're actually being radicalized and moving them to that one-on-one counseling or social services, wraparound services that can help get them the help they need before they cross into a path of violence. And with that, I just want to say thank you to all who are participating in this important conversation.